very warm welcome to this session of the European Commission Research and Innovation Days conference dedicated to reimagining science for policymaking, learning the lessons of the COVID crisis. And in this session, we're going to discuss important topics like the role of research and innovation in policy making. My name is Patrick Child. I'm Deputy Director-General in the European Commission and also responsible for the work of the group of Chief Scientific Advisors who works in support of President Ursula von der Leyen in the Commission and the whole College of Commissioners. And so in today's session, as I say, we're going to address the lessons that we can take away from the COVID crisis for the way that scientific advice feeds into policy making, in the way that we've responded to the pandemic, in the development and the rollout of the impressive vaccines campaign. How do we deal with questions like scientific uncertainty and misinformation? And more beyond that, how do we work together to build greater shared vision and improved coordination between the different scientific advice bodies across the European Union? So to address these important questions, I'm joined by four very distinguished speakers. So firstly, we have Professor Nicole Grobert, who is the chair of the group of chief scientific advisors appointed by the European Commission and joins us from the University of Oxford. And we have Professor Tarmo Soomere, who is the president of the Estonian Academy of Sciences and also chair of the European Science Advisors Forum. We have Anriet Keizer, who comes from the Netherlands, a research fellow at the Netherlands Scientific Council for Government Policy. And finally, I'm joined in the studio with my colleague Nathalie Berger, who is Director for Support to Member State Reforms in the European Commission's Directorate-General for Structural Reform Support. And so what I'm going to do today as your moderator is I think we're going to have a couple of rounds of questions with the panel, and then we're going to open things up for a discussion based on some of the questions that many of you watching today have fed into our system in preparation for this session. So I'd like to kick things off by asking the same question of all of our panelists in turn, and I hope that they'll give us a sort of 3-minute potted summary of their views on how they see the success of our collective response to the COVID-19 crisis in terms of providing scientific advice for policymakers. Was it a success story? What can we draw from it in terms of lessons? Or was it not entirely a success story? So with that slightly challenging question, I'd like to start perhaps with Nicole and the perspective of the group of chief scientific advisors supporting the work of the Commission. So Nicole, please, good morning.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Thank you very much, Patrick, for having me here. Well, there's no straight answer to your question, really. Without a doubt, COVID has put science advice at the spot or in the limelight. People are aware of most scientists, virologists. They probably could name names quite easily, unlike before the pandemic. The problem is it puts scientists at the spot. It really puts them at the spot in the sense that they need to give advice maybe for things that they are not so much an expert of, and it gets a bit shaky or wobbly. And we have to bear in mind that there are different types of mechanisms that provide scientific advice. It's the short-term emergency response and also the long-term science advice. There's one aspect that brings these two mechanisms together, and these are the three main questions. What do we know? What do we don't know? And what we're not sure about? And to answer your question, whether was it a success story or not, actually, I'm not sure. We have some indicators that there has been some success, that we have other indicators that showed us weaknesses. And well, time will tell whether certain mechanisms have been better or worse. And we need to draw lessons from that. There's another factor which I would like to bring in, the time balancing, or sort of time to respond factor. So you need to take into account fast response will always bear some more uncertainty, and longer term response will always have a little bit more on the what we know aspect. And in times of crisis, there is also working under pressure. It's quite difficult, and uncertainty becomes more prominent. In the longer term sense, we have time to engage with different experts from different fields and therefore we can make more consolidated recommendations. And this is where the group of chief scientific advisors sits in within SAM.
Great, thanks very much, Nicole. Perhaps I could now come to you, Tamo, for the same question. You have, I think, a unique perspective at the sort of center of the network of sort of European science advisors across the European Union. What's the feeling in your membership? Is this a success for the industry, if I can call it that, or are there lessons that we need to learn?
I would call it very close to a success story. Because the main reason, I think it extremely strongly highlighted the necessity of the use of state-of-the-art scientific information. It pushed the medical science and science in general into spotlight, as they call it, worldwide, Europe-wide, and nationwide, and including social sciences and the humanities. So it made sure for society that the competitiveness of a region or a country depends on the ability to extract and channel the very best knowledge for decision making at all levels of policy making and economy. And another question, of course, is how comprehensively different nations or regions have made use of these aspects. We have had great success in understanding how to build trust. In critical situations, there are normally much less choices than under normal life. And the experience of the group of chief science advisors is that advice must be not only the best and most transparent, but also should come from a person or group with a legal mandate. And this leads us to a challenge. It might be necessary to introduce some legislation of science advice procedures in countries who do not have any until now. The COVID crisis, actually changed the entire understanding of how science advice to policy works. Essentially, it added a strong and sometimes even clearly predominant operational component. And this component, as Nicole mentioned, it contains massive uncertainties, and sometimes it's based on controversial information. This raises the question, should all advice be equally communicated to society? The advice that is picked up by government, definitely yes. But what about the advice that was not used at a particular time instant? Because not all recommendations can be used immediately, even though they are perfect in long-term run. This is a delicate question that can be solved in many ways. For example, communication to everybody, or limits time embargo, or saying it's just for internal use for the government. We must remember that people have, in principle, the indisputable right to know what is recommended to the government, but it's not obvious how to implement this right. And I think this is a fundamental rather than communication problem.
Great, thanks very much. I now come to the same question really to Ann-Griet. I mean, you have a particular perspective on the way things have sort of evolved in one member state, in the Netherlands. Has this been a success story for the scientific advice community in the Netherlands and in support of government decisions in a very sort of quick, fast-moving environment?
Thank you, Patrick. It's an honor to be part of this panel and to have the opportunity to share experiences from a Dutch perspective, because I feel that this exchange is one of the positive outcomes of this crisis. Of course, it's a very serious crisis, with both in terms of life, death, health, and also the broader economical and societal damages. However, in terms of science advice, it has proven to be an extremely interesting life experiment. We are all in the unique situation that scientific advisors in all countries are facing similar challenges at the exact same time. And what we see in several countries, and in the Netherlands as well, is that science advisors were suddenly placed in the public spotlight. And one of the main lessons I draw is that this role requires more than being one of the best scientists. It asks for a certain craftsmanship. Let me give two examples of what scientific advisors should be able to do. He or she should be able to explain to policymakers and the general public a core characteristic of the scientific process, and that is step by step we learn more. But that implies that it's very possible that advice changes over time, and that scientific advisors should be willing to publicly acknowledge this. An example is the contribution of aerosol transmissions to the spread of the virus. In the Netherlands, the official scientific advisor seemed reluctant to acknowledge this when invited to do so by academics, parliament, and citizen scientists. And this resulted in public turmoil and the fear that the government was not doing enough to protect its citizens, especially because people saw on the news that masks were mandatory in several neighboring countries, but not in the Netherlands. Why do their scientific advisors come to different conclusions? Second, and I think Tarmo and Nicole also mentioned this, is the crisis has shown that communication of scientific insights to the general public is more important than ever for as part of a task for scientific advisors. So what are the precise words that we as academics or scientific advisors use in communicating our message to the broader public? How do we prepare for not merely explaining scientific insights, but also scientific uncertainty? And how do we position ourselves in relation to policymakers that not always follow our advice? So scientific advice needs to be skilled communicators, but we should acknowledge that this type of communication is difficult and should be practiced, improved, and made transparent. So one of the reasons that the Scientific Council for Government Policy tries to strengthen international relations, participates in workshops of the JRC, and is a member of ESAF, is that we want to develop this craftsmanship further. And to do that, we need to share experiences and best practices with others.
Great, thanks, Ingrid. So now I come to Nathalie. I mean, you have a unique overview, I guess, of the work that all member states are doing in their reform agendas, and therefore insights into the different ways in which scientific evidence and advice is feeding into their decision-making processes. What's your perspective? Is this a success story, or do we have a lot to learn?
Well, thank you, Patrick. I would agree with what most of the previous speakers have said. And actually, I think that compared to the previous crises and pandemics, we can consider that the COVID-19 response has been a collective success story. I mean, overall, there has been a rather speedy government reaction, and the collaboration between the governments and the scientific organizations. We've seen a lot of coordination between countries as regards measures, but also helping out with the resources. And that has been extremely important. Scientists were engaged not only in the development of the policy responses, but also in the communication to the public. And that is so important. The collective purchase of the vaccines in Europe was also a positive step that benefited especially the small countries. Yet, I don't want to pass an overall over-optimistic message, and I think that there are several lessons that we need to learn from this experience. If we look back at the early months of the crisis, we can see that they exposed an uneven level of research and advice in different member states, as well as different approaches taken to providing and to using that advice. So a general takeaway from us is that we need to work together to reduce the capability gap across the member states, to use evidence and to develop more transparent and informed policies. I also think that this crisis demonstrated once again that the current administrative systems have been designed in times of relative stability. And now they need to undergo deep organizational, technological, and cultural transformation to become more flexible and to be innovative enough to address the increasing complexity and uncertainty of today's world, and to cater and to prepare for the future pandemics or occurrences or the future crises. And the public administration at all levels across the EU needs to put more efforts to respond to the current crisis and to its widespread effects, as well as to anticipate the future challenges and to prepare, to the extent possible, our economies and our societies. The response cannot be a response of the scientific community on the one hand, isolated, or of the administration and the policy makers on the other hand, in isolation. We will only get to successful preventive measures, we will only get to successful curative measures if we all work together.
Well, Natalie, thank you very much, and thanks to all the speakers. I mean, a lot to digest there. I mean, what I take away from this first round is that, I mean, yes, there are some positive signals, but also, you know, some challenges that you know, where we don't yet perhaps see fully the way ahead. And I'd like to start by coming back to one of the points that Nicole made, and that is the challenge of the sort of pace of change, the policy process sometimes moves much more quickly than the scientific community's advice capacity. And I think that that's a particular issue with the EU, the Commission's group of chief scientific advisors, given the very strong interdisciplinary flavor of the work. And that in order to provide a coherent, well-digested, interdisciplinary set of recommendations, clearly that takes a certain time. So, Nicole, I mean, could I come to you and say, you know, how do we reconcile this challenge of the timescale, the importance of interdisciplinary sort of interaction, and the need to have relevant and timely advice in view of the political
solid, and that is basically supported by all interdisciplinary experts in a group. The group of chief scientific advisors is set up in that form. So we are a diverse group of people with different backgrounds. And the type of advice we give is sort of in the longer term. It takes roughly about a year to produce a scientific opinion that produces advice. In the context of COVID, the science advisors have produced, in collaboration with Professor Peter Piot, special advisors to President von der Leyen, and in collaboration with the group EGE, European Group of Ethics, a trilogy of responses, a fast response, a statement on the scientific advice to European policy during the COVID pandemic, and followed by a scientific opinion that took a little bit longer in collaboration also with the EGE to improve pandemic preparedness and management. And we're currently embarking on a third opinion that will take a whole year to be produced on the crisis management in Europe. And there we draw from the expertise of a wide range of experts.
Great, thanks very much, Nicole. I'd like to come back to you now, Tarmo, and ask you a question rather more focused on the functioning of the European Science Advice Forum. So this global European level sort of forum for collaboration between science advice sort of experts mechanisms. I mean, is it your view that this forum has, at a time when, of course, in a crisis, everyone looks first to their national authorities, their national experts, is this a forum which has shown its worth during the crisis? Or is there more that we can do, perhaps, to build on this really well-established sort of structure to facilitate collaboration and interactions between EU member states and countries that are associated to our framework program in a more sort of regular and effective manner?
Thank you very much for this question. We know that particularly in small countries, we don't have expertise of all the world together. And this forces the small countries to contact and communicate and ask advice from each other. So some countries actually offer very radical solutions. For example, Ireland, where the advice is normally built on completely built on imported sort of external expertise and evidence. As already mentioned, there are occasions where national advice does not exactly match what is recommended by in other parts or even on the continent, EU level. And this is absolutely natural as conditions vary considerably between regions, and also the national mechanisms are also very, very, very different. So what we learned now in working in the European Science Advisors Forum is that we do need connections transboundary and also transsectorial type. So we learned that several really important, active, high quality and successful advice systems do exist, not only in different countries, but also in different sectors. So it is really important to work together, to bring together those people who are driving scientific advice systems. I think that such connections actually work partially on the level of academies of sciences that are involved into the advice routine on different levels, and which are now involved into the EU level through the SAPEA project. So what we try to do, we try to get know to each other, to reach a situation where a good hint for giving advice is just a few clicks or one phone call away. In terms of sub-section of ESAF Academy of Sciences, this kind of exchange has been quite intense and successful between Germany, Estonia, Finland. The bottleneck is of this kind of cooperation exists as well. It is that most of operational advice is given in national language. So the resulting advice or statements or documents that could be used internationally, their production has quite large delays. Documents or statements, they must be not only edited and polished, but also translated. And as we all know that written communication of draft material may lead to really large complications in the area of uncertainty and rapidly changing scientific evidence. So people with national commitment will never distribute draft documents. So what ESAF is trying to do is to translate the most important documents, and by this manner share the experience and try to learn from each other. But we also do, we try to understand which are the strong features of different national advice systems. There are quite many different systems. Some are based on national research councils, some are based on basically single advisors, some are based on national advising bodies, some are based on academies. Every system has its strong feature, and we are deeply convinced that not only flexibility, but also diversity is an asset and one of the pillars of the strength of scientific advice for policy in entire Europe.
Thanks for that, and thanks in particular for mentioning also the network of science academies under the SAPEA envelope, which of course are a very important part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism, working in support also of the group that Nicole is chairing. But I'd like to pick up the sort of general thoughts behind your remarks about the differences between the systems, the differences between capacities in different member states. And bring maybe Anne-Griet into this conversation to see whether, from the Dutch national perspective and her experience, the opportunities for promoting skills and peer learning through international networks are being fully exploited, or whether, from your perspective, there's more that we could do to move in that direction, learning the lessons of the pandemic, of course. So Anne-Griet, please.
Yes, thank you. I think there's always more that we can do. But to follow up on Tarmo's contribution, I think an interesting outcome of the ESAF meeting of June 2020 was the observation that countries with an established science advice infrastructure for a pandemic did not necessarily do better than countries that had to set up an ad hoc structure. And this has stimulated us to reflect on the question what we can do to be more effective. And last week, we published an essay with 2 other Dutch advisory councils. And the English translation will be available on our website later today. All 3 councils were not part of the outbreak management team that provided the epidemiological and medical advice that was necessary to deal with the first acute phase of the crisis. But with other stakeholders, they have been trying to complement this advice based on their own experience and also to broaden the scope of policymakers in this crisis. An example is the COVID-19 think tank that was hosted by one advisory body, wherein several planning agencies and advisory bodies participated. And the central topic of the essay is preparedness. We should not just be prepared in terms of hospital beds, but also in terms of science advice infrastructure. So in this essay, we draw 3 lessons. First, we need adaptivity, both from the advisors and the advisory infrastructure. And from this pandemic, we learned that what starts as a sprint can turn into a marathon. And that means that over time, a different type of advice is needed. Second, we need to improve the possibility to provide multidisciplinary advice. This can be provided by a multidisciplinary body, such as the council I work for, or in a more open or flexible model. But as Nicole said, it takes time to establish the trust necessary to work together. So we need to strengthen these relationships in peacetime so that they are available in an acute crisis. And third, we need to pay attention to the distribution of responsibilities between advisors and policymakers. This is also a task for policymakers. But by explicitly defining where possible what the advice is or is not intended to do, scientific advisors can ensure that knowledge, advice, and decision-making do not become too intertwined. So to conclude, the Netherlands was not unprepared for the COVID-19 pandemic, but we were caught off guard. And I think by creating platforms and links to different levels outside times of crisis, we can ensure a better organization is in place to assess incomplete and uncertain knowledge during times of crisis. And one way to achieve this might be to work together on topics that are at this point in time not part yet of an acute crisis, but will be in the future if they are not addressed. And the most obvious example, I feel, is climate change.
Mentioning that, and indeed, I think one of the topics that we can perhaps get into during our question session is whether there are applications or areas where the lessons that we learned from the COVID crisis can be applied more broadly in other sort of major challenging areas. And the climate emergency is obviously very much at the top of our agenda from that perspective. But I'd like first to come back to Natalie. I mean, in the light of what you've heard, I mean, can you draw any sort of more broad conclusions about what we need to do in terms of translating the experience that we have of emergency action into more structural improvements in the way that we engage in public administration, making science policy interfaces an element of our resilience in future crises? And could you also perhaps, in addressing that, give us a couple of examples of what the European Union, what the Commission can do specifically in order to support member states in strengthening their administrative systems in this way? Natalie.
Thank you, Patrick. Well, the first thing, and that came quite frequently back in what the 3 previous speakers said, is to put the emphasis on the connection. So better connect the public administrations and the scientific organizations. And we see that far too often the researchers are not always aware of all the knowledge needs of the policymakers. or it is not always clear what knowledge is already available, or even which are the organizations that have it. And this creates inefficiencies. There can be instances of contradictory knowledge, duplications, lack of transparency, loss of public trust. So I would call this the institutional aspect on which we need to focus and we need to work. And there are different ways in which we can get good connection to thrive. So we have some examples of member states where some mediating organizations have been established for that task. And I will quote, for example, TAMO and the Estonian Science Advisor in the ministries, the Independent Scientific Council for Government Policy in the Netherlands, or the Chief Scientist Advisor in Ireland, who provide expert advice on any aspect of science, technology, and innovation as required by the government. But second, I think that at policy level, we need to think how to organize more multidisciplinary science input. Quite often, research is commissioned by one public administration to one research partner. However, the complexity of today's issues requires joint research requests. And such problem-oriented or mission-oriented research requires not only relevant organizations to manage the process, but also adequate long-term funding tools. Thirdly, at individual level, we need to work on the development of the right skills and competencies of everyone in the policy-making process. Within the public administrations, we need more scientific literacy, including the understanding of scientific evidence, its nature, the risk literacy, statistical literacy, and critical thinking. In the research community, we need stronger abilities to produce fit-for-purpose evidence and to understand better the key drivers of the policy process. So to come to your question, Patrick, what is it that we can do to help in this direction? In my Directorate-General, in charge of structural reform support, we can provide technical support and advice to the EU member states and to help through the exchange of experience in between the different member states and through building the necessary institutions and processes so that policymaking is better footed in scientific evidence. I can give you examples. We have helped countries like, for example, Latvia, for instance, to develop its capacity to use evidence through its Government Strategy Analysis Center. In Austria, we are helping by training and developing models to use behavioral insights into policy making. We provide support to member states, of course, on demand for their own initiated projects. But we also strongly encourage the member states to get together and to develop together multi-country projects. And multi-country projects, for example, that build on the efforts of our joint research center to reinforce the use of evidence across the European Union. Recently, we have around 8 member states who have expressed an interest to learn from each other and to work towards establishing better structures that support science for policy, strong domestic and cross-border networking, closer links between science and innovation in government. And the idea is also through this peer collaboration to produce very operational recommendations and roadmaps for improvements and capacity building. Very soon, next week, we are going to have a major event with all the member states to present the support that we can provide in the cycle of our technical support instrument for 2022. We are going to propose some ideas of projects that can be followed by one member state or that can be followed by several member states together to advance together. We do encourage member states when they prepare these projects to consult with stakeholders and so, of course, with the scientific community. And there we can get all together with our expertise within the Commission, within DG Reform, within DG Research, with all the innovation potential that we have, with the colleagues in the member state, encourage peer review, and then strive to get better prepared together for future crises.
Natalie, thank you very much, and thank you for being so practical and specific about the various ways in which the European Commission, and in particular DG Reform, is able to support member states' efforts in this area. And before we move on to the other questions that we've got, many coming in, I'd just like to ask each of the other panelists to react to what you've said and pick out perhaps one thing or two things that you've said that are particularly welcome, or whether there's anything missing, anything else that we should be doing. And I see that Nicole wants to come in first. So Nicole, please.
Yeah, I'm burning to comment. So keywords: policymakers, scientists, trust, communication, training. And training, to me, doesn't only include policymakers to understand scientific content, but also scientists and young scientists. And Tamo mentioned SAPEA, the Science Advice for Policy by European Academies. They have recently joined up with the Young Academies, which is a great movement because the youngsters are also needing to get exposed and to get the feel on how to do science advice and how to provide input based on scientific evidence. Canada has a youth council, which is also something that I keep an eye on. Quite an interesting concept that Mona Nemer, Chief Science Advisor to Justin Trudeau, established, from what I remember. And I think that that's a direction we mustn't forget, involve diversity, so not only in terms of subjects and backgrounds, but also age range, in terms of academic age, or also real life age. Include all.
Great. Thanks very much, Nicole. Quickly, Tamo, any reactions also to what Natalie has said?
Yes, thank you. I think we have learned really a lot from the COVID time. We have learned how to work with and how to communicate uncertainty and how to block misinformation when necessary. We have learned how to build exit strategies, which is particularly useful for the climate mitigation problem. We have learned that it's useful to have legislation for science advice, not in terms who has the right to provide it, but how should it be given and how to specify whom exactly to ask. We have learned even more. We have learned that it is extremely important to distinguish advice from lobby. In words of Peter Halligan from Wales, distinguishing giving advice from the role of advocate for resources for science. And this is also a position of the United States National Academies of Science. And we have learned, perhaps most importantly, there is now a general trend to move from individual advisory actors to systems or even ecosystems of science advice.
Thanks. Angrid, quickly from you, because I've got some important questions I want to come to, but any reaction, a comment on what Natalie said?
Yeah, no, I really want to thank her for her enthusiasm and for the help that the European Commission is willing to offer. And I think one important fact of networks such as ESAF and the support from the European Commission is that the reflection of the type of work that we do is really enhanced over the past years. However, if I can extend the agenda, it would be great if we can extend on this basis in the coming years and actually actually start to more exchange the work we do, or even in the future work together on certain topics. So I think that's also something to strive for in the coming years.
Great, thanks a lot, and thanks to all of you. So we have 4 minutes left, and I want to ask one question, which I'm going to merge two of the questions that we've had in, and sort of come back to a bit the challenge that some of you raised earlier about public communication. And the question is, how do we deal with the inevitable temptation for opportunistic short-term use of scientific advice in the public debate? And my controversial bit is, and how do we avoid returning to business as usual in this respect, and thus, avoid the sort of politicization of the scientific advice process? And perhaps I could start with you, Tarmo, and if you could keep your remarks really to sort of 30 seconds, really the essence, it would be great.
Yes, I think it's another lesson. Actually, we have learned, and it's now important to understand that the advisors of the government have to be ready to stand next to the government leaders and not only protect or preach their advice, but to explain and defend publicly.
Great. I think that's a very important message. But we, of course, choose which of the scientific advisors we put next to our Prime Minister. And that is in itself a political choice. Huh? But Nicole, I know you have views on this. Huh? Longer
term views include the youth. I mean, they keep us on our toes. Look at the recent movement regarding climate change. I think giving the youth a voice and listening to them prevents us from going back to business without thinking any further of what we've experienced. Great, thanks a lot. Natalie, you're exposed to the European level political debate, and the opportunistic use of scientific advice is something we are not immune to totally either. So what's your thoughts on this? How do we avoid this polluting our decision making?
Well, thank you, Patrick. I think that if we want to have administrations fit for the future, if we want to have governments and policymakers fit for the future, the taking into account of multidisciplinary scientific advice is to be part of the day-to-day policy thinking. So we need to continue to build on all the lessons that we can take from this crisis, and we need to have this something that becomes not a subject for topic or for discussion. It needs to be part of the normal thinking and of the normal preparation of all policy measures for the future. Working together, being multidisciplinary, and I would like to say, making proper use of all the scientific advice that we can find in every single member state of the European Union. Stop working in isolation, stop working in silos. Working all together will be the recipe for the future.
Great, thanks. I'll give the last word to Anne-Griet on this question of opportunistic use of scientific advice in the policy-making decisions.
Well, the council I work for as the group of chief science advisors has the specific task to advise for the long term. And then there's always a danger that policymakers say, oh, well, this is a very nice report, but they put it aside and focus on the acute issues of today. So one of the things that is really important is, if you advise for the long term, is that you always make the connection to the policies of today. So what should we change today to be prepared for the longer term?
Great. I mean, that's a great note, I think, on which to finish this wide-ranging and I think quite thoughtful discussion. Gives us a lot of issues to ponder for the future, things around the way we interact, communicate our scientific advice, the importance of working together, the interdisciplinary collaboration, which is at the heart of what we're trying to achieve. Tamara has raised the question of legislation better to frame the way we work with scientific advice, and also the challenge of matching the short term and the long term. So thanks to all the panelists, thanks to the Joint Research Centre colleagues who helped us organise this session, and enjoy the rest of the conference.